Hi everyone, I'm Jack Thrambling Raconteur, I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to talk about the poetry of Jack Mapanje, specifically the Chattering Wagtails of Mikuyu prison. Now Mapanje is one of the great poets of the 20th century. He's often regarded primarily as a great political poet in the 20th century, and that he is, but he's so much more than that. Yes, many of these poems deal with his experiences as a political prisoner, as someone who had spoken out against a corrupt regime in Malawi. But Mapanje looks beyond just his own specific personal experiences, and they are highly specific, to look at the connections that he has to his other prisoners, whether they are political prisoners, whether they are prisoners of circumstance, whether they have suffered under the social economy there in Malawi, or beyond them, to the land, to the people who still live in the villages of Malawi, to areas that are being developed and how their lives are changing. And he connects all of these in a very fascinating, very personal way. And that fusion between feeling and intellect is what makes him one of the great poets. So let's just dive in. These poems were written often in the 1980s or in the 1990s, shortly after he'd been released in the aftermath of international outcry. So we have the 1984 Martyrs' Day prayer. If this is how you'd have us pray to you, O Lord, with this last egg from a matted bird startled, this scruffy coin from a street beggar beaten, this lean goat from flummoxed chaperons plucked, this sacrificial lamb from the shrines usurped, our chief's bowl down their banquet halls flashed, their abandoned adulteresses upon us rebels set, this area of schemers, scratching their boils in public, for another grave, unnecessary assault. If this be how you'd have us praise you, O Lord, be gentle to this mortal, whose crime was only the tipple on Martyrs' Day. Break this neck nobly. And he has this beautiful way in which he calls upon religious faith, he calls upon tradition. He draws that link about sacrificial lambs. He has all of this imagery, and the way he ends it with the idea that there are executions happening, that there are political executions, judicial murders occurring every day there around him in the walls of Mikuyu prison. The way that he is so quiet in that shift, and it is horrifying. The prologue to the entire work is, from the vault of Chingwe's hole come these chattering wagtails, desperate voices of fractured souls, nesting on desert walls of prisons, and exiles, afflicted or self-imposed, counting stubborn beads, deprived, laughters and ceaseless tears shed in the chaos of invented autocracies. Now darkly out of bounds beyond these tranquil walls of York, justice. And he had written that upon his release, and he was safely now in England to be able to write and speak truth about what was happening there in Malawi, in Mikuyu prison. And the idea is that the chattering wagtails are these birds that nest there around them. And in the same way that they chatter ceaselessly and they move around, he talks about the way that the prisoners have their experiences where they quietly talk to each other. They try to have some human connection, some human interaction in a place that is as dehumanizing as possible. And throughout these poems, he's very clear around what the experiences are as a prisoner. He opens, and he's just very blatant about that, very clear. In another, he talks about the outside, the way that nature is affected, and the way that the beauty of Malawi has been affected by this regime. So we have a poem, Seasoned Jacarandas. Stiff-collared, hands in pockets, spitting out phlegm and scanning, the point of thankless patriotic. Wakes and timid nights we lied, brother, believing we would soon arrive. Someone must hang around. Knowing there would be no pieces, the true warmth was outside. Today, though seasoned, our metaphors blanch. The jacarandas still deeply. Purple our pavements, but for once, there pop underfoot or tired chills, like those still fresh squads firing. Who'll watch whose wake tomorrow? This self-imposed siege trembles. And again, that moment where he's talking about the idea that there's blossoms and there's fruit and there's all of these ideas around what has come together, and the idea that there have been, parties, there are people who are driving around or moving about, and yet instead the connection is not to those experiences, but rather to the experiences of firing squads. And he's able to draw on these ideas and connect them so effectively. Throughout the book, he has different passages where he has sort of experiences outside of prison, experiences sort of on being arrested and being, wondering, am I going to be executed like my peers have? There are ways then about his experiences in prison and ultimately about his release. But within prison, there is the Chattering Wagtails of Mikuyu prison, followed by the great poem Scrubbing the Furious Walls of Mikuyu. And Scrubbing the Furious Walls is one that Jack Mapanje himself has read in public numerous times. But in the Chattering Wagtails of Mikuyu prison, he opens, "Welcome to the Chattering Wagtails of D4. Before your Gymkhana Club story, let's begin with the history of the wing you've come from. They call it the new building, which is so marvelously blank, as you saw that you'd have cracked up within months, however tough-willed. Thank these D4s for moving you here." And he goes on to talk about their experiences, the way that what it feels like to be brought into this prison, to be brought into this wing of the prison, the society that exists there. And as he ends, he goes, "But there's more. Take the other wagtails of Mikuyu prison, these that chatter in circles, showing off their fluffy wings to you, singing all day. Watch how their splendor presages your visitors, if you are allowed any here. And do not scare these inmates, for when acute malaria or cholera, we don't split these here, admits you to central prison sickbay, these wagtails will follow to minister to you. They are the only priests allowed. Here in the dragonflies, hundreds of moths, in golden robes, the geese floating over, us and more, bringing messages of cheer, foretelling releases to come. Don't laugh. When the day locks up these wagtails, twitter another tale, you won't laugh. When this courtyard wire gauze fills with thousands of wagtails that sleep standing on one leg, head under wings, snoring about today, fabricating their stinking shit on the courtyard below for us to mop tomorrow, and every day you must mop this courtyard to survive the stench. D4 has even devised wagtail shit mopping rosters, the best in the land, definitely by far. Better than your skipping without ropes at new building. D4 is divided into dawn, shifts too, ensuring your choicest weevil infected red kidney beans from these pots. Happily, D4 will spare you the dawn kitchen shifts, though the vampires of new building, those ticks in the cracks of cement floors, still testify here, the fleas in the pores of your desert skin, those hyenas yapping, worse than leprous midnight dogs, those scorpions whose sting sings like brain tumor, the swarming mosquitoes and bats. What, who won't you find here? Welcome to these chattering wagtails of Mikuyu. And this sense that the birds and their song, the way that they are in some ways an only comfort to people who have been run through awful experiences, who have been intentionally dehumanized in a very systematic way, that they try to have this connection to song, to community, by the association with these birds, even though they have to then clean up all of the bird mess, just nonstop. And the idea that there's a stench associated with that. It's not just, he's conjuring up the idea that it's not just the sight, it's not having to walk through it, it's not having to clean it, it's the stench that is there, this feeling of smell that can't escape, and the feeling of the desert on one's skin, the way that it feels to have dust in one's pores, or to have insects like, crawling across, and the different insects and scorpions that they face, and just all of those experiences brought together in this long poem of experience. And from there, he opens with the next poem. Is this where they dump those rebels, these haggard cells, stinking of bucket, shit and vomit and acrid urine of yesteryears? Who would have thought I would be gazing at these dusty cobweb ceilings of Mikuyu prison, scrubbing briny walls and riddling out impetuous scratches of another dung beetle locked up before me here. Violent human palms wounded these blood-bloated mosquitoes and bugs to survive, leaving those vicious red marks. Monstrous flying cockroaches crashed. Up there the cobwebs trapped dead bumblebees. Where did black wasps get clay to build nests in the corner? And he goes on to talk about just all of these feelings, and he goes, say, shall I scrub these brave squiggles out of human memory? Then, or should I perhaps superimpose my own less caustic? Dare I overwrite this precious scrawl? Who'd have known I'd find another prey without charge, without trial, without bitterness, in these otherwise blank walls of Mikuyu prison? No, I will throw my water and mop elsewhere. We have liquidated too many brave names out of the nation's memory. I will not rub out another, nor inscribe my own, more ignoble to consummate this moment of truth I have always feared. And that is what he has done. He has given a voice to the many who had those experiences, to some who suffered even worse than Mapanje had. there in Mikuyu prison. And he's careful to draw links across there. After he's released, he talks about going to visit the remnants of the Berlin Wall and seeing little grains of the bricks and the cement that had been used for the wall. He talks about picking up rocks and feeling this association there between the freedom of the loss, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, and his own freedom upon his release. He tries to draw links to the international community. He's specific. He dedicates poems to people who were murdered. He is, as I had mentioned, very specific, very open in the beginning about the idea that there have been judicial murders, executions in these prisons daily at times. And he draws all of those experiences in just such crystal detail. He never flinches. And that perhaps is he had never flinched ethically or politically, and so he was unwilling to flinch aesthetically as well in his poetry. And so that's, again, I think what sets him apart, what makes him unique. He talks about the way that farms have been destroyed through industrialization. He talks about baobab trees. He talks about older people in their villages and how their lives have been irrevocably changed. And he's utterly fearless in each poem. So again, he's someone I highly, highly recommend you explore if you have not. He's written numerous volumes of poetry. I believe he published his autobiography much more recently. And he is still alive, and he will periodically give talks or attend events. And so he's someone to sort of pay attention to, and the way that he links our experiences here in the 21st century with what was happening in his own experiences at the end of the 20th century. Thinking about other works, I, of course, was reminded of Why Did You Leave the Horse Alone by Mahmoud Darwish, more poems of exile, poems that are very specific about home and about that yearning for something that is being wiped out and destroyed. Additionally, I think it's impossible to think of 20th century Africa without mentioning Patrice Lumumba, and specifically the volume Lumumba Speaks, his speeches, his political writings, his essays, even letters from the late 1950s and into the early 1960s before his murder. Other African writers would include the great Wole Soyinka. He had The Open Sort of a Continent as sort of his series of incredibly polemical and authentic essays. But he's probably just as famous for Ake, The Years of Childhood, his books about growing up in Nigeria. Someone like Sipho Sepamla with A Ride on the Whirlwind, drawing a link towards South Africa and political struggles there. Ngūgī in Kenya with Petals of Blood. The great Ousmane Sembène in Senegal with God's Bits of Wood. Again, each of these is a novel that's an extraordinary novel from an extraordinary writer who has much to say, but they are explicit about what is happening in their society, what is happening in their culture, and how are individual actions pushing back against that. Elsewhere, Ricardo Romero taps into that fear in South America with The President's Room. Certainly within the 20th century, Primo Levi was one of the great writers and someone who, again, was unsparing in his own reflections, his being during the Holocaust in Europe, and his memoir specifically, If This Is a Man or The Truce. But each essay or book he would write was just absolute truth zeroed in. Another writer would be Claude McKay, an African-American writer, and someone who was drawing links sort of internationally at a much earlier time. So in the 1930s, he's written Amiable with Big Teeth about the attack from fascist Italy on Ethiopia, and the way that there were Ethiopians resisting, Africans resisting, but there were also Afro-Americans who were able to lend material support and sort of fundraise to try and support the Ethiopians during that experience. And then finally, certain one could draw on Alexander Solzhenitsyn, but Varlam Shalamov with the Kolyma stories and the way that he describes the exile in Siberia. So I hope that if you've never heard of Jack Mapanje, I would certainly encourage that you check him out. Some of his poetry is anthologized, and there are so many wonderful African voices and African poets to read. So let me know some of your favorites. Thank you.